Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Chav Zayin. As we said on Friday, we're going to start on Chav Zayin base, the top of the page. The piece of the Gemara in Chav Zayin Mouth is really connected to the question of Chavavim base, which we're also going to refer to. We're still dealing with the Gemara from Chavav. But before we even deal with that, let's take a look at the Mishnah on Daf Lamed. The Mishnah coming up in a couple of days from Daf Lamed, because we're going to deal with that today, that issue. A man is a Nazir, but his father was also a Nazir. So what's the deal? The Mishnah on Daf Lamed, 2 days from now. The Mishnah says like this. We're bringing down the opinion of Rav Yossi. The Gemara brings down other opinions. The halacha is not necessarily like Rav Yossi, but this is what the Gemara says, this is what the Mishnah says, and I'll briefly tell it to you outside first. If a man's father was a Nazir, and the man's father set aside money for his karbanos, what we call mos stumin, and yesterday at Daf Hayomi we saw that mos stumin, according to Rashi, where he explained it was that he just set it aside without saying anything. You didn't say anything, you just put money aside. That's called mos stumin. And we had on Friday that, they've also before, that halacha ibn Nazir, it's a halacha l'moshmi Sinai, that if you have mos stumin, in other words, set aside for the 3 karbanos, even though there's chatos money in there, and when a person dies, you're supposed to destroy the chatos. If it's an animal, you let it die, and if it's money, you throw it into the Dead Sea. Still, it's halacha l'moshmi Sinai that it goes for an adult. You give it to the Beis Hamikdash to bring karbanos with it. Fine. That's when the money is stumin. Okay. Let's say the father was a Nazir, and he had mos stumin, and then he died. The son said, okay, father's dead. He had that money set aside. I'll be a Nazir, and I'll bring my karbanos from that money that the father set aside. He didn't use it. He's gone now. I'll use that money. So the Mishnah is going to say, according to Rav Yossi, that doesn't work. You can't do that. However, if him and his father were both Nazirim at the same time, not that his father was a Nazir, he died, and then the son said, I'll be a Nazir and I'm going to use it. I'll be a Nazir on the condition I could use my father's money for the karbanos. That's no good. But if they were both Nazirim at the same time, the father and both Nazirim, and the father set aside money there and said, this is mos stumin, here's the money for the karbanos, without saying, this is my chiyuv, just put it aside, that money, and the son, then the father died before he got a chance to bring his karbanos, but the son was already a Nazir, and then the Nazir said, the son said, I'll be a Nazir on the condition I can bring use my father's money. According to Yossi, that is good. He could use that money for his karbanos. It doesn't go to the Beis Hamikdash. That's what the Mishnah says. Let's look at the Mishnah inside on Daf Lamed. If a man can shave based on the zir of his father, when we say megalech means bring the karbanos. But it doesn't work that way with a woman. Special we see it only works that way with a man, not with a woman. And if she cannot, even though let's say she's the heir of her father, if there were no sons, whatever, she was the only heir, still she can't do it. Kate said, what's an example? So he first gives an example where it doesn't work, according to the gears that we have in this mission. Kate said, Mishayav of Nazir, man's father was a Nazir. Bifish mos stumin. And he set aside money without specifying what it was for, just for this karbanos, but he didn't say which is what. He didn't say this is my chov. He didn't say, as we saw, when it comes to the karbanos, if you have the animals, even if you didn't say this is my chat, this is my yashin, but the animals, it's clear from the age and the sex of the animals, which what? A chatos is a female. So the ones that's a female is for a chatos. The young lamb is for the ola. The older ram is for the asham, or for the shlamim rather. So the asham only becomes tameh for the shlamim. So it's pretty clear what the animals are for if you have animals. But here there was only money. So if him and his father was a Nazir, now the father died, then the son became a Nazir. The son said, Hareni Nazir, I'll be a Nazir on the condition that I could use my father's money for the karbanos. Amar Rav Yossi, and no, it doesn't work. That money goes in double, like we said, mos stumin. If you put aside money without unspecified money, that goes for the dovers of the Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't work. What does work? Where can he use his father's money for his own karbanos? Well, Huva Aviv Nazir, both him and his father were Nazirim simultaneously. V'hifish aviv mos stumen. Doesn't mean that they were necessarily, this took the same period of time, but they were both Nazirim at the same time. The father set aside money, unspecified money. So Mason, the father died. Then the son could say, I'll be a Nazir on the condition I can use my father's money for the Kabbalah. That does work. This is the way the Mishnah reads, and that's Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara will talk when we get to Daf Yomi on Tuesday. We'll discuss it because the Rabbanan disagree. Maybe possibly like the Rabbanan, there's different girsos. Fine, we'll see that. But both, yeah, both Nazir at the same. No, the father died. They're both Nazir at the same time, and then the father died before he finishes Naziris. Then the son. Then if the son says, "I'll be a Nazir," no, but then he was already a Nazir. Right, correct. But he wants to now use his father's. He could use his father's. In other words, in that case, when the father died, the son was already a Nazir, then the son could use his father's karbanos, his father's money for the karbanos. Okay, that's what the Mishnah says there. Now let's look on Chav Zayin Amud Beis, where we're holding most of the second line on the page, from the top of the page, on Chav Zayin Amud Beis. What were we discussing? We said that if you set aside money, unspecified money, you didn't say these are for my karbanos at all. You just put aside some money, like Rashi said. You didn't say anything. You just set aside some money, and then the guy dies, or his naziris was annulled for whatever reason. You don't bring the karbanos anymore. It goes for a nedava. If it was set aside in any way, shape, or form, even if you didn't say this is my chat, this is my oil, you just said these are for my karbanos. We said then the animals are brought. Meaning the chatas you let die. The ola you bring as an ola, and the shlom you bring as a shlom, except there's no breads, etc. And except there's no, you don't do the breads. There's no bread with it. Okay, it's brought as a shlom of an answer. Now the Gemara is going to ask a kash on that. Right? The Gemara. Oh, one more thing. What did it say on yesterday's Gemara? We said yesterday, Rav Nachman. This we say that if you said it's a behema, if you set aside animals. In other words, even if you didn't say this is my chat, this is my own stuff, but if you actually, it wasn't money, it wasn't unspecified money. You actually said these are the three animals. You could always tell from the animals what they're for. So that's then if he dies or the Naziris is over, the animals, again, the chatas you let die, the Ola Shlamim are brought as an Ola Shlamim. But let's say the animals were Balei Mum, they were blemished animals. So Rav Nachman said on yesterday's Daf from Chavav days, Rav Nachman Hadami Behema is like Mefureshes, and you let it doesn't go for an adava, but you bring the karbanos as they are, and the chatzos will die. Lo shal t'mim, only if it was an unblemished animal. An unblemished animal, that's what if you set aside these animals, so the animals have to be brought as such. Of course, the chatzos you let die, the other ones you bring. Aval balas mum, if the animal is blemished, if the animals are blemished, hareka stuma, that's like stuma. That's like money, which is unspecified. Why is that? So the Gemara said, Hareka stuma. Why? Because when you set aside blemished animals, you can't bring them as a carbon. Blemished animal can't have a carbon. So what are you bringing? So basically the idea is that you will redeem these for money, right? You'll redeem these for money. They're like kedushas damim, and with the money you'll buy karbanos. So effectively, it's like a check. Instead of money, I gave a check, which is going to be transferred into money. So I gave these blemished animals, which aren't good to be bought as a carbon. I'm going to use them as money. That's what Nachman said. That if, and this is important to understand because that's what the whole Gemara today is going to be based on, is that if you set aside blemished animals, that's like setting aside unspecified cash. Because the blemished animals is not necessarily the chatas for this one and the ola for this one. All these blemished animals are going to be transferred into cash, and with the cash you're going to spend it. So it's like unspecified money. Now the Gemara on Chav Zayin and Beis at the top is going to ask cash on that. Masav Rav Amnuna, Umiyamrina, do we really say behema balas mum kestumah? Is that really true that the behemoths are blemished? That's like money, which is unspecified money, which if the Nazir no longer brings the karbanos because he's either dead or he used other karbanos or his Naziris was annulled, whatever was stopped, not annulled really, because it's a Taras Dharm, the whole thing wouldn't be chal. But let's say a woman whose Naziris was cut off by her husband, or a boy who stopped being his Naziris, as we said, if the father made him a Nazir. So there's cases like that, it's like most stuma, which goes for an adava. So do you really say that Behemah is like stumadam, is like unspecified money? Toshma, we see otherwise. Kate said, Amar Ish Megalech on Nazir Savav. This is the mission that we just talked about in Daf Lamed. So it could be that he's also referring to the Gemara, the Brayso Lamed Beis that brings down this case on Lamed Beis. How does a man bring karbonos for Nazirs of his father? Bisman Shahaya, the Gear says, Bisman Shahaya of Nazir, his father was a Nazir. He was not, his father was. The Hifish Aviv and his father set aside money, Nazir, so unspecified money, Umay's father died. But Omar, now the son said, Hareini Nazir, Amanash Aglech Amos Abba. I want to be a Nazir on the condition I could use my father's money for the karbonos. That's the mission we just said. Ein Zeh Megaleach, that's the Girsa in the Bach. Ein Zeh Megaleach Amos Abba. That doesn't work. Can't do that. The money goes for Nadav and that's it. But Hayu Lo Mos Stumos. But let's say, right, Hayu Lo Stumos Yiflon Nadav. That's what happens. That Mos Stumos are Gersa Avav and the money was Stum, it goes to the Rabba. Hayu Behema Freshes. Let's say he set aside animals. Set aside animals, we've already explained what's the deal if animals were set aside and the man doesn't bring his karbanos, he died, or if it was a woman, her husband terminated her naziris, or a child who objected to the naziris, what do? Chatos tamus, you let the animal, chatos, you let it die. Ola tikavola shlomim, shlamim. Like we said before, if he set aside animals. My love, afilu balasmum. Since it says over there, in other words, the Mishnah doesn't really take the case of Mufresh. So Rashi says it's like you learn it out from there. It's obvious that way because we're talking about money. The kivim the tani moslo. It's not that case. Because Rav Nachman balas mum. Why? Because my love feel basmum. Meaning, so this is really the Brisa. The Mishnah didn't really talk about the animals, but on the Brisa we'll see says. That's if it was money. If it was money, it goes to the Dava. If your father was a Nazir and he set aside money and it was unspecified and he died, the money goes for the Dava. But if he had animals, you got to bring them, as we said, Chatos Tamus, and the other ones you bring. My love, Afilu Balasmum, isn't it? Even if you left animals who were Balimum, you just said animals. Didn't say what kind of animals, doesn't mean even Balasmum. And that shows you that Balasmum doesn't go for the Dava, but it actually has to be transferred and you bring Korbanos with it as load. We're talking about Tamima, only unblemished animals. Our balas mum kastuma. You still want to maintain your idea that a balas mum, if it has a blemish, it's like unspecified money. So Ma'ira Mos, why talk about money? Why talk about if a father left over money? Then what? That goes for the dava. Lema haisel behema balas mum. Say even if it was an animal who was a balas mum, also you put in the dava. Why don't you tell me a bigger chiddush? Why talk about only money? If you say balas mum also goes for the dava, that if you left over animals which are blemished, they go for Nadava. So tell me that. And for sure, a case of money. Why have money? That's exactly what it means. What's the purpose of Balamum? Why you sanctify? You can't bring it as a carbon. If you have animals that are blemished, why would you sanctify them? L'dami, for the money, right? L'dami, it's for the money. So dami ha'namos, it's for their value. The value is the same as money. It's the same thing. In other words, whether I set aside unspecified money or I set aside animals which cannot be brought as a carbon, it's the same thing. It's unspecified money, and the same malacha applies. That's his answer. Now the Gemara is going to bring another long kasha, and this kasha is going to basically the same idea. Talk about animals, so it doesn't mean mashma only, even if it's balas mum. The Gemara says no, that a balas mum is also just like cash. What's the case here? Masav Rabba.
We said that the person died, and his chatos is we let it die.
If he set aside animals, if he had animals,
animals, and his chatas we let it die, and the two other animals
are brought as
nadava, but
not nadava. They're brought. One's brought as an ola, one's brought as a shlomim. In other words, you have to bring.
He's dead. These are still animals that don't have balim in.
That's correct.
So how do you bring them?
You bring them without a balim. In other words, the rule of the chatos mesa is because a special halacha by chatos, if there's no owner, you let it die. But the Olam and the Shlomim could just be brought as an Olam and Shlomim. It's not an Adava to the base of Mikdash. They're brought as such. The one that's an Olam is an Olam, the one that's a Shlomim is a Shlomim.
Who's going to eat the Shlomim?
Who's going to what? Eat it?
Who's going to eat it?
Anybody. Kohanim could eat it. Anybody could eat it. If you bring a Shlomim, I could eat it too.
I understand that.
Yeah. Anybody could eat it. No, it's just brought.
That don't have balim.
It doesn't have a balim, correct. There's no balim because the guy's dead. Don't forget, this is not as a kapara. The reason why you can't bring a chatas or an asham after a person dies, can't bring his carbon because it's only brought us kapara. There's no kapara over here. The only shlummer brought us their goodwill. They're part of the nazira. The process of the nazir. The protocol is that a nazir has to bring these karbanos, but it's not brought for a kapara. So therefore, you can bring them even though there's no owner. Masav Rabba, another question like this. The beginning of Vayikra talks about all the karbanos, and it says over there, Masav Rabba karbano. The first one that he brings down is from Asher Nasi Yachta in Perak Dalet of Vayikra. In Pesach Chafez, it starts talking about Asher Nasi Yachta. If the king sins, what's the rule about him? So it says in the next pasuk, Ahodulav Chatasa Asher Chata Behavius Karbano. Always says this. We're going to see the emphasis on his carbon. You got to bring your own carbon. You can't use somebody else's. That's going to be the gist of this brisa. It says carbon, but carbon yotze. You're only yotze with younger maids. So carbon, you can't bring your father's carbon. What do you mean by that? Now we're jumping. We're not talking about a nazir right now. Now we're talking about a regular case. Let's say your father sinned in some form and he set aside a carbon. Can you use that carbon for your? Once the father set it aside for his sin that he sinned. And then you want to use it. He says, okay, Sonny, you could use it. Can you use that? No, you can't do that. But you can't use your father's carbon because it's set aside for his sin and for him. I might think you can't use your father's carbon because he said it maybe for a minor sin. What's a minor sin? A minor sin is something where you're not chayav kares or mises besdin. For example, you swore falsely. You bring a carbon olaviore, or right, so as you swore falsely, or you denied that Adis, or you went to the base mikdash in a state of when you were tamei, where you bring a carbon olaviore, but it's not necessarily cars. Well, that could be cars. So let's talk about the shvuas bitoy or shvuas where you swore falsely. Shvuas bitoy, shvuas Adis. That's a minor sin. So maybe if your father set aside a carbon for a minor sin, you can't bring your carbon for a major sin. A major sin is, let's say you ate chayla by mistake. You have to bring a chatas there. Why is it a major sin? If you did it on purpose, you chayav kares. Or if you committed murder or adultery, you chayav mises besin. So if you did it b'shogeg, you bring a chatas. So maybe you can't use your father's carbon if he set it aside for a more minor sin, something that doesn't involve kares like swearing falsely, and you can't bring it for your sin, which is a bigger sin. Or the other way around. In other words, once a carbon is set aside for a type of a sin, you can't use it for if it's set aside for a minor sin, you can't use it for your major sin. If it was set aside for a major sin, maybe you can't set it for your minor sin. Maybe that's what he means. That's what Gemara says. If my father set aside, we both liars, we both swore falsely or whatever. My father set aside a carbon for a minor sin. I could also use that carbon because it's the same kind of a sin. So maybe it can be transferred. I could use it now. So my father set aside, he was makdish this animal, right? So I'm going to use it now. Or for a major sin, I can also use it for a major sin. Talmud Omar, we got another pasuk. It says carbano. He says our Gemara has it with two carbonos there, but I think it just means to say there's two of them now. Because in the Mefarshim it seems to say that it was only listed once. But anyway, karbano, meaning now we have a second time. What's the second time? Not only in pasuk chaf gimel of Perak Dalet, where it says Olav Chadasa Chatasa, but also in pasuk chaf ches, it says also in nefesh. It says in pasuk chaf nefesh chatchatzah. A person sinned, the commoner. The common people, baby carbano. Not only does it say by Nasi in Pasuk Chaf Gimel, in Pasuk Chaf Ches, it also says carbano, emphasizing the carbano yotzev. You can't be yotzev with your father's carbon, even if he set it aside for a similar kind of a sin that you have to do now. Maybe if your father set aside an animal. Then you can't use that for your sin. You can't use it even if your father set aside an animal for a minor sin. You can't use it for your minor sin, or for a major sin. You can't use it for your sin because he set aside an animal. Why do we see the difference by animal? Because we say something by Nazir. This is where we come to our case of Nazir, We're comparing now. If my father said did a minor sin, and he set aside an animal for it, I can't use that animal for my minor sin, because we find by Nizir, as we saw in the Mishnah Daf Lamed, that if my father was a Nizir, set aside karbanos, and he died, that's it. Those animals have to be brought as they are. You can't use those. But maybe you could be Yotzei if your father didn't set aside animals, he set aside unspecified money. You could maybe, if your father just set aside unspecified money for a carbon, didn't say what it was, just put aside some money. Even if he set aside for a sin that was major and you want to use it for a minor, or the opposite way, maybe that does work. We did say in that Mishnah that there is times when you could use your father's money for your karbanos. Where? Remember when you were a Nazir and with your father at the same time. Not that your father died and then you took upon yourself a Nazirus. According to Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, not like the Gemara is going to say later on, but the way the Mishnah reads, Rabbi Yossi says, if you and your father were Nazirim at the same time and your father died, you could use that money. If he just said it unspecified, you could use it for karbanos. So maybe here too. Maybe Sharei Adam Megalecha Melsav Naziris Bisman Shestim. We're at the top of Chavches Navan Shestim. We love Zman Shem for Russian. If the money was set aside, this money is for Chatas, this is for all this for Shalom, then you can. But if it was unspecified money and you were a Nazir at the same time as your father, you could use that money. So maybe also, and it's where you're not a Nazir. Your father set aside money for a sin that he did. Maybe you could use that money for your carbon. Talmud Omer, a third time, Karbano. What's the third time? In Pasuk Lamed Beis, it says, Vim Keves Yavi Karbano. Again, your carbon. It's his carbon. It's got to be his. You're not Yosef the father's carbon no matter what. Yes, by Nazir we said, we're going to say in Daf Lamed, that's a special exception in certain cases, but a regular carbon, if your father set aside an animal for a sin, no. Yachol, so the Gemara goes on, the third line in Chavches, Yachol lo Yetzei, the most, Sheifrish, you can't use the money that your father set aside, and the Girsa in the Bach is what? The most, Sheifrish Avav Afilu Menakala, Alakala Menachamura Chamura, maybe you can't use that money, Ava Yotzei, but carbon, Sheifrish La'atzmo. Okay, we give up on your father. If your father set aside any kind of a carbon, set aside any kind of money, right? You can't. Karbano, it's got to be yours. You can't use your father's money. Okay, fine. Forget the father now. I set aside money for a sin that I did. I use it for a different sin that I did. That's the question. Again, I set aside some money I had sinned, I swore falsely, and now by mistake I ate some chaylev. So I want to bring that animal, instead of bringing it for the Shuas Biti, I want to get rid of the bigger one first, get rid of the bigger case first, chaylev, which is a sin of chatas, a sin of karas, if you did it for Mason. So maybe I could do that. Maybe I could do that. Talmud Omer, Karbano al chataso. Back in Chavches, the Pasuk Chavches. What did it say there? It said, "Oh, hoda elav chataso asher chata, chataso asher chata." That's what the pasuk says. Karbano al chataso, right? That's what it talks about karbano, and it says al chat hoda elav chataso. Telling me it's got to be for that sin. Karbano. It says in that pasuk. Actually, the karbano is after the word chataso in that pasuk, but both words are in that pasuk. Talmud Omer, karbano al chataso. That's what Rashi says. And Rashi's examples, let's say, for example, I had two sins. I ate chaylev b'shogeg and I ate dam b'shogeg. Those are two chamuras. Or two sins, two minor sins. Shvuas bikod, and I swore about that. And a shvuas bitui, where I just swore falsely. Or shvuas ha'edus. All those different kinds of, that's a kal, shvuas ha'edus, shvuas bikod, and shvuas biti. Those are kalos. And the chamuras are things that involve chorus. If I did it b'mezid, like eating dam or eating chaylev. So that's what I might think. I might think that you'd be high, that I could do that. I could switch. I set aside a carbon for eating dam, and now I want to use it for eating chaylev. Al chataso, ache karbano l'shum chataso. It's got to be for the chatas. The Bach says l'shum chataso. Okay. Yachol goes on. Yachol lo yetze b'behem shifrish la'atzmo. So I might think you can't use an animal that you set aside for sin A, and I want to use it for sin B that you can't do menakala, like she was beaten, she was bekadin, or vice versa, or menachamura al chamura, dam for chaylev, or menakala al chamura, or can't use a animal that I set aside for a minor sin for a major one, or menachamura al kola, shekain im hifresh behema ala chaylev. Listen to this. If I set aside an animal for eating chaylev, for the chatos for eating chaylev, the heavy al adam, and I brought it for dam, all adam el chaylev, that doesn't work. Share lo mo'al v'lo keeper. It's Gemara talks about this, that when are you mo'al? What is mo'al? Mo'al means sacrilege. Sacrilege words means that I use something of hegdish and I turned it into profane or secular. I turned it in by using it for a common purpose, not for a holy purpose. So that only works if let's say kedushas damim, something that I could change its value, I could take it out of being holy and make it unholy. But an animal which is unblemished, which is set aside, let's say a chatas for a sin of eating chaylev or eating dam, you can't change it. You can't be moel in that because it stays in its kedusha. Moel only works, sacrilege only works when you take it out of kedusha and make it secular, make it profane. Here you can't do that. So over here, I would say there, shekain imifresh beim ala chaylev adam or adam beim ala chaylev. If I set aside an animal for one sin, let's say eating chaylev, and I want to use it for dam or vice versa, there maybe it doesn't work. Sharei lo moral, I can't commit sacrilege there. You can't commit sacrilege because you can't turn it into profane. But lo keeper, if you can't commit sacrilege, you also can't atone for it. Why? Because you can only bring an atonement from your own carbon, from something you made holy. If it was already holy for something else, you can't get atonement for that. That's what I might think. Avol Yod say, and that's really the case. Avol Yod say that I might think the most shiur shlatzma. Let's say I set aside, I sinned, I ate chaylev, and now I didn't set aside an animal. I set aside money. Yod say the most shiur shlatzmo for my own sin. Menakala kala from one sin for another minor, chamura, or menachamura kala menakala chamura. If I set aside either anyone, I might think if I use cash, right? I set aside cash for that. That does work. Shekani mifresh la'atzma mos. If I set aside money mos for that's not the word should not be minachelev, but it's rather lechelev. Behavior ladam or adam evachelev. That there you are moel because it's cash. Cash. If I set aside cash for bringing a carbon for chelev, and instead I use that cash and brought a carbon for dam or vice versa, since I am moel there, I should get a kapara. So maybe here also I should say that if I set aside money for one carbon, forget about the father now. We're not dealing with the father, for your own carbon. I set aside money for one carbon and I use it for another carbon. That should work. Why? Because since money, if I use it for the wrong purpose, I'm moel, I commit sacrilege, therefore it becomes mine, and I can bring a kapar from there. Al-chataso. Rashi learns this al-chato, so it's not the al-chataso in Pasuk Chafres, but it's rather the al-chataso in Pasuk Chavov. That's called Chavayaktev, because of Shlomo Kippur Alav HaKohen Mechataso V'nisachlo. That's what he says, or al-chataso or mechataso. Rashi seems to say, even our Gemara says al-chataso. The Rashi quotes the pasuk, Tamla b'chipur alav hakohen al-chataso, and chataso there, it's really, well, it doesn't really sound like it sounds like the one in Chavches, right? But that's not the chipur hakohen. The one in Chavches says ohelav chataso. Chipur alav hakohen mechataso is slightly different. But in any case, it says there al-chataso in that parsha. Achei karbar l'shem chatao. The carbon has to be l'shem chatas. In other words, that no matter what, you can't bring a carbon that your father set aside for any sin. You can't bring it for any sin, even if it's a similar sin, the same sin. You can't bring a carbon that you set aside for one sin, even if it's a similar kind of a sin or the same chaylev twice, let's say, or chaylev and dam, similar chiyuvim. You can't do that at all, even though you might say, if I set aside money, it should be able to work. Because since I could commit sacrilege on the money and turn it into mine again, I should be able to bring it. Mashman, you can't do it. So it's got to be, the carbon has to be for what you set aside, it's sin. If you set it aside for some other sin, whether it was cash or whether it was an animal, you can't use it for this sin. Oh, so it doesn't work. Tani miyas, but what do we say? Behema, if you set aside an animal, ma'alav afilu balasmum, mashma, even a balasmum, even a sabalmum, also you can't use it. So what are we saying here? That's exactly our issue. That even a balas mum, But what did we say? We started by saying on yesterday's daf that if it was an animal balas mum, that's like cash. But he says mashma, but an animal you can't use. Sharei, well, you can't use an animal, but an animal that's a bal mum, l'chora, maybe it's the same thing because it says animal. Who says you're talking about a bal mum animal? Mashma, any kind of an animal, even a balas mum animal, you can't switch. Gemara says no, lo, it's me. We're talking about me. The same thing we gave an answer on Amid Beis. That I feel about balas mum, the balas mum says no, it's me. We're talking about a tmima. A tmima animal can't use. Of a balas mum, set aside a balas mum. My costumadami, we're saying that's like something like unspecified money. So my really telling Mo, Shiur for Shavit. Going back to the case of what was this all about? We're not really concerned here about the issue of your father set aside or you set aside an animal for some sin, and now you want to use it for another sin. Your sin, from your fathers to you or you to you. But when we refer to the case of animals of Nazir, what do we say? We're talking about behemoth animal. Why talk about behemoth? Even whether it's specified or unspecified animals, the same thing applies. You can't use it. And you said that unspecified animals have halacha like cash when it comes to a nazir. So he says no, it only means animals that are tmimim, but animals that are satum, animals that are blemished, behemoth mamum is like cash. So if that's the case, Myra Tani Mos, why talk about Moshe for Shavah? Why talk about Moshe? Listed Balmum. More the same answer. That it means that why? What is an animal that has a balmum? What is it fit for? The dummy, for the money. So dummy hanamos, money for its value. Value is the same as money. In other words, that the reason it doesn't mention behemoth balas mum is because there's no difference between behemoth balas mum and cash. It's the same thing. Either way, it's unspecified, and therefore it has halacha that unspecified money. If the guy dies or can't bring the carbon for whatever reason anymore, the money goes for an adult. It's not brought as an ola and a shlama, but it all goes to the base of mikdash. And from that they bring karbanos. All right, we'll pick up from the Mishnah tomorrow. Mitzvah Shem on Daf Chav Ches. Have a good day. Shavua Tov, everybody.